In this video, we'll talk about media effects and cultural approaches to mass communication research. Of the two research approaches I'd like to discuss, I want to first talk about cultural studies. Early cultural studies research really stems from the 1800s in Karl Marx's and Antonio Gramsci's work. What these two scholars really did was investigate how mass media support existing hierarchies. Now, these two weren't necessarily working at the same time. Karl Marx, or Marx and Engels, really came about first and really built up the idea of class structures and how class structures then support the people in power, and those without power tend to work in oppressive situations to support those people. Antonio Gramsci, while overlapping in the timeline of events a little bit towards the tail end of Marx's life, then added on to it. So what these scholars really wanted to look at was how mass media are used as a tool by those in power to not only create and disseminate dominant, powerful ideologies, but then convince people without power that those are the ideologies that best suit their interests. So what they're doing is they're examining how popular culture distracts people from redressing social injustices. And we see this happen in today's society when people are more concerned about what's on Jersey Shore or going out and buying the latest iPhone 6 than they are about the fact that so many of their neighbors are homeless, or so many of their neighbors are without food or shelter or anything like this. That they don't care about the social injustices that are impacting their communities and their society, but they're very much more distracted by things, items, technological toys than real life issues. So one of the ways they did this is they addressed the subordinate status of particular social groups. For example, looking specifically at issues of class. And my own research does this as well. So when we look at the role of class in society, especially from today's day and age, if we look at the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, what we saw in the aftermath of that crisis was so many American citizens who were left homeless, who were left in poverty, and who are still struggling to sort of rebuild their lives even now in 2014. When we look at those particular social groups with respect to this larger idea of mass communication, we have to look at how did the media represent populations in poverty? How are homeless people identified in mass media? Are they seen as working class citizens who really have just hit a bad spot in their life? Or are they seen as a blight to society, as a burden or a problem to society? Are they framed in such a way that we don't want to help them per se? We don't want to try and see the larger issue of homelessness from the eyes or perspective of a homeless person, but instead we want to see it more as they brought it on themselves. So, for example, if we think about welfare recipients, we're more apt to believe that the people themselves abuse the system, that the people themselves have brought it on themselves because they're lazy and unmotivated and uneducated, instead of looking at the structure. And that's what Marx and Gramsci are arguing for us to do, that we need to look at the structural problems in capitalism that create such extreme poverty and homelessness in our society. So mass media play into this by demonizing those groups, denigrating those groups, and convincing the rest of the populace to support those ideas, to support the idea that people on welfare are horrible people and don't deserve to be on welfare and don't deserve our support, and we shouldn't help them one bit. The next scholar I want to briefly discuss is Jürgen Habermas out of the Frankfurt School. Habermas is coming from the standpoint, again, from a very critical perspective. What I mean by critical is a critical theoretical scholar looks at society and communication structures and mass media structures from a perspective of power structures and hierarchical oppression, meaning how those in power suppress or oppress those below them in a class level to maintain the status quo, to maintain their power or gain more power. So what Habermas is doing is he's actually trying to look at our society and identify the spaces in society that allow for rational, critical debate, which he sees as important to have an engaged citizenry, to make sure that people such as yourselves are educated, and with that education, speak eloquently on the social issues of our times so that we can engage in a logical, reasonable debate, which we can argue we don't see, especially even with our politicians. That when they go out in what he calls a public sphere, when they go out in the public sphere and they should be having a rational, critical debate, instead, they're riddled with logical fallacies, and they are name-calling, and they are mudslinging, and it's anything but a logical, rational debate. Next, I want to talk about how cultural studies researchers actually go about conducting their research. Now, these are just 3 types of way, but really we could teach a whole class, and hopefully in the future we do actually teach a whole class on the variety of tools in the cultural studies research toolbox. But of the 3 ways that I will discuss, one of which is the textual analysis. So what you're doing with the textual analysis is you're actually looking at text. That may not necessarily mean like a newspaper text or a magazine text or a textbook, although it could. It's actually just another term for a media artifact. So it could be a video, it could be a YouTube video, it could be a tweet, it could be a Facebook post, it could be a music recording, it could be clothing. What we mean by textual analysis is just really any type of media artifact where we go and we conduct a close reading. What that means is we're finally analyzing the artifact at hand and interpreting the cultural messages attached to it. The second approach that we can use is what's known as audience studies. The subject being researched is the audience for the text. So if we want to understand what motivates young people to watch, I keep saying Jersey Shore even though I know it's off the air, but for lack of an even worse and horrible example, what motivates young people to avidly watch Jersey Shore? Let's pretend it's still on the air. If we want to know what motivates people to watch reality television so badly, we would actually analyze and work with the audience themselves. We might hold focus groups, we might hold sessions where we're sitting there with the audience members themselves as they watch the programming to get a better understanding of what motivates these groups to consume these media. And then we interpolate from that larger understandings about the audience themselves, because that's a huge component of mass communication. Thirdly is what is known as political economy studies. This stems very closely from the last slide about Marx and Gramsci and Habermas. What we do in a political economy study is we're examining the interconnections among economic interests, political power, and how that power is used. So when we conduct a political economy study, we are looking at structures of politics and economics. So for example, when we look at the political economy of the mass media, as so many scholars have done in the past few decades, what we're actually looking at is the corporate media structure of the industries that create our media. So not just ABC or NBC, but the mother companies of those. Who owns ABC? Who owns NBC? I implore you to go and actually look these things up, because those structures then impact the content we receive, what goes on the news, what frames news items, how we think about things, what we even decide to talk about. So for example, the Ferguson, Missouri verdict that came out. How to have people discuss this? How have conversations evolved around this? What did CNN show us? What did the media show us? Did the media show us people peacefully protesting, or did the media show us people looting and rioting and setting things on fire? Well, the corporate structure of those organizations plays a huge role in what we saw, because if they think whatever bleeds leads, then they're going for a sensationalist approach. They're not going for what's best for society, but they're going for what's best for their money and their ratings.